Your Excellency, Philemon Yang, President of the 79th Session of the General Assembly, Mr. António Guterres, United Nations Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Ali Youssouf, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Excellencies, PRs and permanent observers, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. I have the distinct honor and privilege to welcome you all to the 2025 edition of the Africa Dialogue Series, High-Level Policy Dialogue. This annual event is organized by the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa and the Permanent Observer Mission of the African Union to the United Nations in collaboration with a number of committed partners, and it serves as a platform to amplify the priorities and perspectives of African member states and the African Union on the global stage. This partnership is rooted in a shared commitment that the two institutions have, and the Africa Dialogue Series provides an opportunity for interactive and inclusive dialogue and a space where a broad spectrum of stakeholders, policy and decision makers, experts, academics, civil society, youth, regional institutions, and international organizations convene throughout the month of May to exchange ideas and craft forward-looking actionable recommendations aimed at accelerating Africa's perspectives. Each year, the dialogue is anchored on the African Union's theme of the year, and this year, we rally around a profound and timely theme, which is justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations.
A theme that demands we confront the past honestly in order to shape a just future. True reparatory justice begins by reckoning with history. Over 4 centuries, beginning in the 16th century, more than 12 million Africans were pulled from their homes, shackled and condemned to brutal servitude. The enormity of these horrors cannot be measured by numbers alone. The legacy of this dark chapter remains entrenched in our present, in how our societies have developed, in the lived experiences of the descendants of enslaved Africans. Thus, reparatory justice must go far beyond financial and material compensation. It demands comprehensive legal, educational, psychological, and socioeconomic measures. Measures tailored to the unique needs of people of African descent and aligned with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the African Union's Agenda 2063.
Africa is a continent of boundless energy and possibility. But for too long, the colossal injustices inflicted by enslavement, the transatlantic slave trade, and colonialism have been left unacknowledged and unaddressed. I deeply regret that these wrongs were perpetrated by many countries, including my own, and they continue to distort our world today. Decolonization did not free African countries or people of African descent from the structures and prejudices that made those projects possible. When African countries gained their independence, they inherited a system built to serve others, not them. They inherit economic models and years of neglect in social and institutional investment during the colonial era, creating lasting challenges, shaping post-independence reality. structures based on exploitation persisted. So did racism. And the long shadow of colonialism can be felt in many of the continent's current conflicts and governance challenges. Many African countries were under colonial domination when today's multilateral institutions were created, and that injustice is reflected to this day. Excellencies, we point to the poisoned legacies of enslavement and colonialism not to sow divisions, but to heal them. Reparatory justice frameworks are critical to redress historic wrongs, address today's challenges, and ensure the rights and dignity of all. Such frameworks encompass a broad range of measures. We need a comprehensive approach developed with the participation of affected communities to achieve accountability and redress. And we must be clear-eyed about the fact that attempts to repair the past ring hollow unless they also seek to dismantle its manifestations in the present. From racism to extraction of African resources to the injustices embedded in structures, institutions, and global governance. Animated by honesty and justice, we can transform the legacies of slavery and colonialism into equal and respectful partnerships. Partnerships that ensure African countries take their rightful place in shaping global decision-making, that help to deliver on the priorities of African and Caribbean countries and people of African descent, and that help to ensure that all Africans and the African diaspora have the opportunity to thrive.
It is important to further emphasize that achieving justice requires reforming global structures, in particular the international financial architecture and the United Nations Security Council, to redress historic and ongoing inequalities rooted in neocolonialism. Cultural restitution is equally central to this agenda. And we fully support ongoing African-led processes to return rooted cultural heritage and human remains. We all recognize that there can be no sustainable development without peace, stability, and justice. This year's theme calls for the recognition of the need to repair centuries of harm, enslavement, economic exploitation, cultural dispossession, and systemic exclusion. This justice is embodied in several urgent calls to action. A call for climate justice. Our continent, which contributes less than 3% of global emissions, suffers disproportionately from the consequences of climate change. The restoration of degraded ecosystems and the climate resilience of African communities must be regarded as reparations, not merely development assistance. A call for trade and economic sovereignty. Africa will only unlock its full economic potential if the global trade system becomes just and equitable, if the African Continental Free Trade Area is fully implemented, and if South-South cooperation, in particular with the Caribbean and the African diaspora, is scaled up. A call for educational and technological justice. We must invest in Afro-descendant youth and women, particularly in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and emerging technologies. This is a way to restore what was taken, our knowledge system, our languages, and our intellectual heritage. A call to strengthen Afro-diaspora solidarity, to empower Afro-descendant women, and to protect and celebrate our living global legacy, a legacy that stretches from the Nile to Bahia, from Havana to Port-au-Prince. Excellencies, what we call reparations today is in truth a moral duty of humanity to itself. I hope that this high-level dialogue will lead to a strong and ambitious call to action, one that translates our shared political commitments into concrete, measurable steps aligned with the goals of Agenda 2063 and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
Really, the team challenges us to think boldly about reparative justice, economic transformation, and the shared prosperity that Africa represents, not just for Africans, but also, of course, for people of African descent, and really for the world. So as we mark this occasion, we're reminded that political independence alone, it is not enough. True liberation lies in economic empowerment, where as Africans, we can harness the continent's immense potential, whereas Africans, we are the primary beneficiaries of the continent's vast natural wealth and resources, from human resources, of course, to critical minerals, to digital innovation. Africa holds the keys to global progress. What became really clear through the last 3 weeks of conversations and dialogues is that unlocking the potential requires more than resources, though. It demands reform, and this was already brought forward here earlier today. Reform in financial systems, in governance, and in how we mobilize and channel investments. So today we will explore some pressing questions around this theme. How can Africa lead its own transformation in a global system that is still shaped by historical inequities? Reparative justice, as mentioned, is not a zero-sum game. And so what does it actually look like in practice? And how can we ensure that Africa's youth, remember, we have the largest cohort of youth in the world, our greatest asset, how can we ensure that they are equipped to drive the digital and economic revolutions, not of tomorrow, of today, because the digital revolution is happening now, as we speak. So it's not just a debate about Africa's future, it is, but not only. It is a conversation about our collective future, our collective well-being, and our collective sustainable development. Because the Africa we want, in reality, it is the Africa the world needs. How we will do it? Well, I thought you'd never ask. Let's get some answers then.
Let us be unequivocal. An economy that exports ore and imports smartphones, that exports coffee beans and imports instant coffee is not sovereign. It's extractive. Ladies and gentlemen, the African Continental Free Trade Area represents a strategic vision and collective effort to undo this extractive legacy. With 1.3 billion people, Africa is the largest free trade area in the world by population and a platform for reshaping African economies around regional value chains, industrial development, and policy harmonization. It offers a vehicle for transformation, not just trade. However, the road ahead for Africa is long and steep. We face an annual infrastructure financing gap of $68 to $108 billion. Debt servicing costs in many countries exceed investments in education and healthcare. Restrictive global financial conditions and inflated risk premiums constrain our development space and reinforce dependency. Climate justice must also be understood as reparatory justice. Africa bears the brunt of a crisis it did not create. Predictable, fair, and accessible climate finance is not charity, it's an obligation. Without it, sustainable industrialization and resilience will remain out of reach. This year, African Union's theme, Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations, is a timely and urgent call to action. Reparative justice must go beyond financial compensation, as was said earlier. It must mean structural reform of global trade, finance, and governance systems that still reflect colonial hierarchies. Reclamation of our cultural and historical identity as a foundation for dignity and unity. Recognition of the continued role of the global North in sustaining extractive models through unequal rules and systems, and the creation of new equitable partnerships, built not on paternalism or charity, but on fairness, mutual respect, and solidarity. Africa does not seek sympathy. We demand justice, we demand restitution, and we demand a new international economic order, one anchored in sovereignty, sustainability, equity, and shared prosperity. Finally, Africa is no longer a passive site of extraction. We are the architects of our future. We remember our past not to remain in its shadow, but to ensure its lessons shape more for a just tomorrow. From the ashes of slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism, and from the rubbles of underdevelopment, Africa is rising, united in purpose, rich in potential, and unwavering in dignity. Africa remembers, Africa rises, Africa reclaims.
This brings us to a fundamental question. What is the role of ECOSOCC in this important context? And in responding to that, I want to clearly indicate that one of our fundamental roles is to mobilize civil society organizations, which is a cornerstone of our mandate in advancing the AU reparation agenda, and ensure that the strategic mobilization of civil society across the continent and the African diaspora is central to this endeavor. It is also important to note that we have also played a significant role in terms of bringing civil society perspective through the civil society white paper that ECOSOCC has led the process in developing, in ensuring that we have civil society input and there is a sense of ownership in the final outcome of the African Common Position on Reparation. We are also playing a significant role in the popularization and ensuring that we're able to raise awareness and building the global movement for reparation. The road to reparation is complex and often met with resistance, but the AU's commitment is clear. The cost of inaction is too high, and the moral weight of history is too heavy to ignore. Thus, ECOSOCC calls upon all stakeholders, African government, diaspora communities, international partners, and civil society organizations to unite across borders and generations, build platform for truth-telling, intergenerational learning, and collective healing to confront the system that sustain historical wrongs and dismantle the structural legacies that continue to marginalize African people. Moreover, we remind the global community that reparation encompasses far more than financial compensation. They require a human rights-based approach that centers restoration of dignity, truth, and institutional justice. This includes political restitution, legal redress, cultural reclamation, psychological healing, the return of looted artifacts, and the rectification of African marginalization in the global governance. In conclusion, at ECOSOCC, we reaffirm our role as the voice of the African people, the bridge to the diaspora, and the engine of participatory governance. We will continue to mobilize civil society, facilitate international solidarity, and amplify the voices that history tried to silence. I thank you.
Zimbabwe, like many African countries, continues to export minerals that power the global economy, yet receive only a fragment of the real value. Our sovereign efforts to redress historical land inequities triggered punitive sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, as they are called in UN speak, that largely remain in place 2 decades later. This is how structural injustice persists through modern instruments of control cloaked in legality. Reparatory justice must begin with economic restructuring. Africa's continued reliance on raw exports, compounded by crashing debt and inflated risk premiums, perpetuates vulnerability and dependence. Zimbabwe has taken steps through policies such as the 2023 Base Minerals Export Control Order, which mandates value addition in taxes and processed exports. But these efforts must be matched by global reforms, reforms that democratize finance, restore agency over capital flows, and invest in infrastructure, innovation, and industrialization. Yet, economic justice alone is insufficient. It must walk hand in hand with social transformation. We must institutionalize equity in access to education, healthcare, and employment, especially for women and youth. Africa's young people are not merely beneficiaries, they are architects of the continent's future. Justice demands that we empower them with tools, spaces, and voice. Cultural injustice is equally vital. Rather, cultural justice is equally vital. The legacy of colonialism robbed us of not only wealth, but identity. Restitution of looted cultural artifacts is part of the journey, but our deeper battle is for the narrative sovereignty. Zimbabwe continues efforts to repatriate stolen cultural treasures, yet more crucially, we are revitalizing indigenous knowledge, languages, and oral traditions. Reclaiming these is not nostalgia, it is resistance, it is self-definition, and the heart of decolonization.
So it is, we need to create a very clear understanding of what are the transmission channels. So that, for example, our permanent representative, the excellencies in New York or in other platforms out there, understand that we must look at this as the decisions that are taken at that level, they impact on what we can do here on the continent. For example, we must go strong in a common voice to pursue the call for an holistic and coordinated global framework on asset recovery, because the numbers suggest that we are losing, I said earlier, about $90 billion on illicit financial flows. What are the instruments that we need to put in place with a view to ensuring that at the global level, this becomes a center part of our policy interventions and discourse. So for us, therefore, we argue that extractives or illicit financial flows has to be viewed from a broader perspective of securing Africa's self-reliance. And this is becoming increasingly important in these days where, as you know, we are seeing a disruption of the international norms that multilateralism was founded on. We are seeing forms of mercantilism that are taking us back to the old times, on the colonial times, where it is power dynamics that inform how transactions are made. So it is that understanding and connecting the dots between all of those processes that will enable us to address illicit financial flows, to ensure that our minerals are a factor towards our structural transformation. Our minerals are used towards enabling us to achieve Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063. Those dots are not clearly connected. And you also need to be mindful of what is called as political underdevelopment, where often local interests also play a role in our effort or against the effort to try and promote those principles of resource-driven industrialization and economic diversification. So how are we going to address that requires, therefore, that understanding, requires a license to operate that goes beyond the contracts that are signed between governments and mining companies. We need to ensure that the interests of local communities and other interested parties are also taken into consideration in the so-called, these days we call it sustainable development license to operate. It goes beyond the interests of governments and mining companies. It looks at interests beyond even our own jurisdictions, and where financial institutions, where consumers and everybody else that are part and parcel of this ecosystem have a role to play for us to change the dynamics and secure that we don't go back to this extractivist model.
This links, of course, to the human rights. And I think, therefore, the second international decade for people of African descent, as we know, that has been long in coming, but we had a whole decade first in the past 10 years where we have gained a greater understanding and visibility of the lived experiences of people of African descent. That has already tackled some of the discussions and challenges, but particularly, of course, there a lot more is needed, as was recognized when we now go on to the second decade. And I think the linkage to the issues that has been discussed here and all the big challenges for the development is really absolutely necessary. So we need the leadership, we need the strong political will from member states to make sure that we use that occasion that the second decade does provide for us. It really is what is needed to overcome, exactly as I think all speakers have referred to, the challenges in addressing the entrenched legacies of colonialism, of enslavement and transatlantic slave trade, of enslaved Africans. So we really can redress the situation of people of African descent, and that needs a comprehensive approach. And of course, for us, it's very clear that human rights needs to be at the basis to repair the legacies of the past. But again, as Sam said, of course, not being stuck in the past, but precisely to move forward to a very different vision based on justice and dignity. So the second decade can provide an impetus for adopting decisive action to dismantle the systemic racism, which we know is sadly still quite prevalent, and that needs new policies, it needs the laws, it needs the functional institutional measures that are effective. And that's why states really are encouraged to be guided. We do have guidance, we have recommendations, and a lot of experts have been involved in working at this. We have the United Nations human rights mechanisms that provide recommendations, and also the High Commissioner's agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality, because it's really moving on to that transformation that we need to push for. We're promoting effective and meaningful participation for people of African descent and for communities. And again, as others have stressed, women and youth in particular as a focus to guide the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of all reparatory justice processes, but also the developmental processes. So really making sure that participation is effective and meaningful. All the processes should, of course, be gender sensitive and also grounded in intersectional and intergovernmental analysis of the impact of enslavement and colonialism and the long-lasting consequences. We need to step up and broaden the efforts to eradicate systemic racism and racial discrimination through the second international decade, placing racial equality at the center of sustainable development consistently and coherently. And that's, of course, states and other stakeholders who are encouraged to make sure that the Durban Declaration and Program of Action and Program of Activities of the International Decade for People of African Descent are implemented and pushed forward, and also the agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality that comes from our High Commissioner for Human Rights based on member states' requests for a report and its conclusions where the recommendations came from. They should ensure that people of African descent are not left behind in the implementation of the 2030 agenda, and of course linkage to 2063 agenda is very clear.
Millions of Africans were ripped from their homes, an enterprise that became one of the most atrocious crimes of modern history. This dark chapter was followed by a colonialism that methodically devastated our societies. It pillaged our wealth and it impeded our development. The scars from this are not just a thing of the past. They can be seen today in the socioeconomic conditions, endemic poverty and structural barriers that prevent the emergence of our nations. The injustice that we are referring to is not just symbolic, and the justice we are calling for is essential to repair this historic damage and create dignified living conditions for all. We are calling for true reparatory justice, and this must be accompanied by concrete actions and a profound change in international architecture. We must urgently reform the international financial system in order to enable equitable access to resources, to technology, and to financing for African countries. We are calling for illegitimate debt to be cancelled. This is preventing our growth, and we should have a policy for restituting the expropriated wealth. And this can only succeed with strengthened dialogue with the African diaspora and a true bridge to our continent, which is a lever for our development. Together, we should promote ambitious development plans that are focused on reducing inequalities, on education, on health, and on employment. In this context, the African continental free trade zones that has been mentioned by a number of speakers represents a strategic opportunity to stimulate regional integration and strengthen our collective resilience and global competitiveness. But this must be part of a global partnership founded on recognizing past injustice and based on equitable cooperation. Finally, reparatory justice should not be thought of as a confrontation between former colonizers and African states, but rather an opportunity for reconciliation and collaboration. It calls for shared responsibility, mutual recognition of the wrongs of the past, and the building of a shared future built on lasting prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to go beyond words and begin a true dynamic of reparations. Social and economic justice are the cornerstones on which we can build a better future for Africans and for people of African descent today and for future generations.
We cannot fix what we cannot see. So we know that we must ensure that everyone is counted and accounted for. That is why UNFPA is leveraging evidence, data, and statistics to highlight and support member states to address gaps in the persistent multidimensional inequalities that Africa and people of African descent face. In collaboration with UNGA, CARICOM, UNFPA is working with government to ensure that digital censuses are of high quality and building National Statistical Office capacity to support censuses and population data analysis so that we can visualize and better support populations that are left behind. With ECOSOCC, we are providing technical support for the inclusion of self-identification question in censuses so that we can better understand socioeconomic disparity for Afro-descendant and indigenous people and design programs that meet community needs. Overall, our work with regional bodies on population data, gender equality, and sexual and reproductive health lays the foundation for people-centered development. We focus on greater social inclusion and equity to ensure that development and economic opportunities are for all and not for some. Excellencies, we are navigating in an era of profound transformation with sweeping shift to the global development landscape, shrinking fiscal space, and mounting uncertainty. Yet, this is also a moment of incredible bold possibility, a time to reimagine our partnership to be resourceful beyond resource alone. It is a moment to tap into political and intellectual thought leadership to forge stronger and more inclusive coalition that can advance human rights, gender equality, and reproductive health. And as our UN Secretary General said a little bit earlier so eloquently, it is time to replace colonialism and embracing for respectful partnership.
It is time to unveil the true magic behind the Agenda for Sustainable Development 2030 and the Agenda for the Africa We Want 2063. That magic is very simple. Inclusive and equitable growth for a shared prosperity, leaving no one behind, as Afro-descendants are on all continents. Let's walk the talk together. But it takes courage, resolve, and above all, it takes friendship.
CARICOM is firmly of the view that a united global Africa with a strong partnership between Africa and her diaspora is essential to realizing justice and development for Africans and people of African descent. Through our collective advocacy, the global community is observing the second International Decade for People of African Descent, 2025 to 2034, which presents a renewed opportunity and platform to realize socioeconomic justice and respect for the rights of Africans and African-descended people. It is an opportune time to confront the realities of racial injustice and mobilize international cooperation through the United Nations, the Commonwealth, and other intergovernmental bodies. We welcome the partnership with the African Union on this vital agenda and look forward to strong political outcomes and civil society engagement at the second Africa CARICOM Summit to be held in September 2025 in Ethiopia. We also welcome partnerships with international agencies and civil society organizations that share the vision and commitment to reparations as a pathway to healing, dignity, and sustainable futures for Africans and people of African descent around the world. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are at a defining moment in history, the outcome of which will be determined by the tenacity and depth of our collaboration. Thank you.
Why is it important for younger Africans to see reparation as a tool for development? It's important we see reparative process as a tool for development because it has factors of trying to repair, trying to restore, trying to reimagine what our future should be. And that's why we think this dialogue is important, and that's why we want to thank the African Union for involving young people. But it has to start with us defining in our own time what a reparative approach should be. So in this context, it means that we have to acknowledge, we have to apologize, we have to find a way to restructure, we have to abolish all those biases that still exist in one way or the other. It is true that transatlantic slavery has ended, but we know that there still exist some forms of slavery, either in the way of exploiting our economic resources, or that in the way of interfering in the way we prioritize what is important to us, or even in the case of loan debts that we have to pay again the same colonial people who they know too well that we've not developed enough for our place. And that's why young people in diaspora are very much committed in telling us that true reparation lies in us trying to repair our past with clean mind, trying to be our brother's keeper. We don't want revenge. We're not shaming anyone. It's just a need for us to understand that in history, there's need for us to sit back and use best practices to reset our framework. And we have that already in place. International community, the AU and the United Nations have approved already the issue of restitution as a way to make things work. And it is happening already. Netherlands has promised to return over 120 bronze images from Nigeria. We are aware that in Senegal, the Al-Hadar Omar Atta sword was returned back in Dakar. We're also aware in Ethiopia, the Makwadal treasure in some of the European countries are also being planned to return. So for the global communities, you're already doing that already. That's some of the attributes of reparations. So we as Africans, as young people, are not saying something new. These are the existing structure. However, we want it coned down to meet the peculiarity of the 21st century. And what's the peculiarity of the 21st century? The peculiarity now is that there's a rapid digitalization age going on, and we do not want to be left behind like it used to be during Microsoft years. We want to be now on that table discussing with you before regulatory systems come on board. There's an urgency to address climate change. As you know fully well that Africa is the least emitter of climate change, but for some reason we're the ones at the brunt end of everything. We've never seen a cyclone before in Mozambique in 2018. There was a cyclone in Mozambique. They did not know what it is. There was no helicopter. There was no early warning system, and many people died. In Syria alone in 2017, there was a 10 hours rain that divided the hill and buried over 7,000 people. Till today, some people are still missing, all because we don't have that technology, that knowledge. We do not advise our African leaders to prioritize the loans they take from our colonial masters to target development, advancing the interest of young girls, and ensuring that we build an entrepreneurial society. So for us young people in diaspora, and also young people across the continent, we're pleading that if you want to use the existing principles that we already have, like restitution, do it for digital equity. Invest in Africa's digital equity. Ensure that the broadband or the internet space that we have is much more broader. Let's encourage more coding.
Yeah, so thank you very much. What I would like to say, the conversation around reparatory justice should not be limited to intergovernmental negotiation or state-centric diplomacy alone. We need to create a broad-based kind of an environment where civil society, other like-minded institutions have a role to play so that the conversation becomes more transformative reparatory discourse rather than a state-centric negotiation or state diplomatic approach to it. So I think we require more of a broad-based participatory governance kind of an approach in this particular kind of conversation. Then it creates room for us to be able to shape the conversation and to get the outcome that we desire.
Emperor Haile Selassie I, in his statement at the UN General Assembly in 1963, which was later immortalized by the legendary African diaspora singer from Jamaica, the great Bob Marley, I quote, "Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, the dream of lasting peace in the world will remain a fleeting illusion." Sadly, racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia are still alive and well today. Therefore, the restoration of equity and dignity is not just good for Africa, but it's in the interest of humanity at large. The activities this year, including policy roundtables, youth forums, and diaspora consultations, have been instrumental in amplifying these voices. Justice must be holistic, participatory, and reparative. To build the future, reparations must be seen not only in monetary terms, but as a comprehensive approach to healing and transformation. This includes restitution, public apologies, debt cancellation, fair access to technology and global markets, and investment in education, healthcare, and cultural revival. It also means empowering African youth at home and in the diaspora to define their future. This dialogue should not conclude as an event, but mark a re-energized global moral and legal movement. Africa stands ready to walk this path with all justice-seeking peoples of the world. Africa's destiny will be shaped by those who have survived the past, understand the present, and determined to build the future.